In this lesson, we're going to talk about translucency of materials in our Advanced Material Editor. Alright, so with translucency, it is a little bit different than the regular materials that we've been talking about. So with regular materials, we've been talking about the diffuse color, the reflectivity of it, and its refractions. And we've talked about just the surface of materials themselves. And we've also got into transparency and that sort of thing. But now we're in translucency. And we're talking about how light is absorbed and scattered in materials now. Now we've kind of touched on absorption up to this point, but now we're going to get into it a little bit further. Now we're going to be discussing subsurface scattering with translucency. Now subsurface scattering is basically whenever a light enters a material, it's going to be absorbed into that object or that material and then reflected out at a different point. And this is really seen in things like candles and skin. So if you have candles and you have them lit, light is going to be bouncing into one area of that candle wax, and it's going to exit out of that candle as a different color and even in a different direction altogether. And that's the reason that we get that different color. Now the same thing with skin. If you hold a light behind one of your fingers or something like that, or even behind your ear, light is going to enter it at a specific point. It's going to scatter and exit at a different point, and that's why you see that red color in there. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and open up our material editor and make sure that we're under the translucency panel, and let's enable subsurface scattering. Now with this enabled, you can see how this has already changed our material at this point. Okay, it almost seems like it appears as if it is wax already. Now let's go to our translucency section and let's talk about average depth. Now this is the main control. Average depth is the setting that controls how translucent the material is going to be. It indicates the average distance traveled by light inside the material. So if we have a large object, we need to make sure that our distance is longer. So with my sphere here, if I go ahead and do a quick render with this applied, you'll see that it gathers light, and it's lighter around the edges in areas that are shorter distances or shorter thicknesses. And you'll see that that light exits out at different points along this surface here. Now there are some areas that there is no light exiting through this. Now if I bring up my material editor again and I take this distance down to, let's say, like 0.6, I'll hit OK and then render this out, and it's going to appear black because no light is able to get through this. No light is able to scatter and exit this object. So it's all being absorbed into this sphere. Let's go into our average depth. Let's take that up. And if we take this up even higher, let's go to about 60, and let's hit OK. We'll do a quick render on this, and you'll see that this overall material seems very light compared to before. Let's go to our pictures just to see that difference there. So you can see that we have our short depth, which no light is able to exit. We have our higher distance in which the light is able to travel, and it seems very light. And then we have that average, which some light is being trapped inside this material, and some is able to be, is able to exit. Right? Now let's open up our material editor again, and let's go to balance. Let's take a look at what this means. So we have absorption and we have multiple. Now balance is the setting that controls the amount of absorption versus multiple scattering that takes place inside the material. So by default it's set to 50%, which means that all the absorbed light is redistributed by the multiple scattering. Now you can get some interesting effects by adjusting this balance. So if I set this up to a little higher on the multiple, let's go to up to about 80, and then we render this out, you'll see that light is not being able to exit as much. Now it's not nearly as dark as just that very shallow or less distance traveled there that we had before. Okay, so it doesn't look exactly the same. It's just that black material. Let's take it up to absorption. Let's go to about 10%. Let's hit OK. Let's render that. and you'll see that light is able to just exit. Okay, it's being absorbed and then being distributed out here, so very light. So let's go ahead and just take this back down to that 50%. And let's go to our refraction index here. Now, we've already talked about what refraction index does. Depending on the refraction index, it could change the overall look of our material here. So let's go ahead and start to work with this a little bit here. So if I take my refraction index up, let's go to like 1.4 or so. Let's hit OK and render that out. You'll see that we have that same material that we had before, but it's not quite as dark or not quite as light. Right? Let's go back and let's take that refraction index down, and you'll see how that's changing it all together there. It's not being able to refract as much. Let's take it up pretty high. Let's go up to about 1.8 or so. Let's hit OK. We'll render that. Okay, and it still looks pretty much the same, but we're getting a little bit of a different color here across the bottom. So again, we can experiment with this and get exactly what we need. So we're going to go to about 1.0, again, to our default value. Now let's go to absorption here. Now we need to make sure that this is actually checked in order for this to work. Now we've already talked about what anisotropy is here. And we know that anisotropy is, or anisotropy, that's kind of a hard word to say there. We know that what it does is it takes light in different directions. So like we said before, it's good with like fabric and things like that, and even hair, where light is going to hit it and it could come out in a different direction. It's going to give us a little bit of a different detail. So if we want the light to go in a different direction based on its orientation, if we want it to go a little bit further to the back, we could do that. Or if we want it to appear forward, we could do that as well. So you can see how it's darker here. Now if we go backward, okay, now the light is going to be sent back to the light source. Okay. If we go forward, it's going to be absorbed into the material itself, okay, away from the light source. Okay, so if we were doing a candle, we want to do backward, and it's going to basically reflect that back. Okay, now this appears darker. Now my light source is back here, and actually let's make sure that it's still there. Okay, my light source is back here, behind my object here. Let's go to my sphere. Let's go to our material. Let's go to forward. This appears darker. Let's hit OK. Let's do a quick render on this, and you'll see that that light is actually passing through to the camera. So it's going forward from the sunlight toward our camera. All right. So this is kind of like if it was a candle. Okay, so let's go back to our material editor, and let's drop this down. We want this to go forward, but we don't want it to be so translucent. Okay, let's go to like 0.3, and we can come in here. We could change the absorption filter color. So if we wanted to change this to something like an orange color or something like that, we can do so. And then we have our multiple scattering, and all that we have here is going to be our filter color. Let's change this to a red, or a brighter orange there. We'll hit OK on this, and you'll see how this changes the overall material. Let's hit OK and let's render this out. Now we're not able to see this as much. Let's drop down that absorption. Let's go to 0 on this, and let's just see what that looks like. Okay, so we're getting some of that brighter orange showing up at these points and where the light is exiting out, and then we have some of that lighter orange appearing around those areas, and then we have just that darker color that's being absorbed and light is not able to exit. And let's go back to our material editor, and we have use infinitely thin surface model. Now this is going to be used for rendering one-sided translucent material. So if you wanted to do something like a sheet of paper, you could do that, and I would use this to do so. Now if I hit render on this, you'll see that it doesn't really work here because it's a 3D primitive object. Okay, so you can only use that on planes. Hit OK, and we'll turn that back off there. And you could begin to experiment with all these different options here and try to create wax materials and things like that. Really great set of options here. Now let's get into our next section in the next lesson, where we're going to be discussing the effects panel of the Advanced Material Editor, and we'll wrap the Advanced Material up in this next lesson. So I'll see you then.